In June 2014, a 28-year-old German man named Lars McCain traveled to Var, Bulgaria with a group of friends. They were on vacation, enjoying the beach town, the cheap drinks, and the nightlife. Lars was by all accounts a calm, quiet guy. He wasn't someone known to get into fights or cause trouble, but while out one night at a bar, Lars reportedly got into an argument with a group of local men, possibly over a football rivalry. The fight left him with a ruptured eardrum, which meant he couldn't fly home with his friends. The doctor told him he needed to stay behind and let it heal. His friends offered to stay with him, but Lars insisted they return to Germany without him. He claimed he'd be fine. He just needed a few days to rest alone in Bulgaria. Lars checked into a cheap hotel near the airport. Over the subsequent days, Lars's behavior became increasingly erratic, leading to one of Europe's most baffling disappearances. He made several panicked calls to his mother, instructing her to cancel his credit cards, and claiming he was being followed. He even left his hotel in the dead of night, convinced he was under surveillance by 4 unidentified men. He even texted his mom, asking what the side effects of an antibiotic he'd been prescribed were. His behavior kept escalating. The hotel staff described him as nervous, pacing and constantly checking the windows. Then on July 8th, the day he was scheduled to fly home, Lars arrived at Varna airport, and things took a dramatic turn. Surveillance footage from the airport shows him walking into the terminal calmly at first, but within minutes he appears agitated. He's seen speaking to a staff member, then backing away nervously. Suddenly, without any visible trigger, Lars sprints through the terminal, dashes through the automatic doors, and runs at full speed across the airport parking lot, leaving behind his luggage, passport, and all of his belongings. The last known footage of him shows him vanishing into the trees near a construction site. No one has seen him since. His disappearance has become a breeding ground for theories. Some believe he had a psychotic break potentially brought on by a reaction to an antibiotic he was taking, or a latent mental illness triggered by stress. Others are convinced something more sinister was happening, that Lars was genuinely being followed or targeted, and whatever he encountered in those final moments was terrifying enough to make him run into the wilderness, barefoot and defenseless. There were alleged sightings in Eastern Europe for years after, but nothing ever confirmed. The strangest part is that his mother insists that Lars was not mentally ill. She believes he was in danger, that he may have stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, or gotten involved in something darker than he realized. The image of him running wide-eyed and desperate has been viewed millions of times online, yet no one knows what scared him that badly, and no one knows where he went. In 1912, in the small town of Opelizas, Louisiana, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar disappeared while on a fishing trip with his family near Swazi Lake. His parents claimed he vanished sometime during the day, possibly while wandering near the water. A massive search was launched immediately. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the area, dragging the lake, searching the woods, and even setting off dynamite underwater in case his body was stuck in the lake bed. But Bobby was gone. The town was devastated for 8 months. His disappearance became a local obsession. Then in early 1913, a boy matching Bobby's description was found traveling with a man named William Walters, a traveling handyman in Mississippi. Walters claimed the boy was the son of Julia Anderson, a woman who had entrusted the child to his care, but the Dunbars were convinced the boy was Bobby. Walters was arrested for kidnapping. The authorities arranged for a reunion between the boy and Bobby's mother. At first, the boy didn't recognize her. Ulysses later claimed she hesitated, unsure if the boy was actually hers, But after spending a few days with him, she announced to the press and the police that he was, in fact, her son. Case closed. The newspaper said Bobby Dunbar had been found. Walters was sentenced to prison. The boy was returned to the Dunbar family and raised as their own. But there was a problem. Julie Anderson, the woman who had entrusted the boy to Walters, showed up. She insisted that was her son, Bruce, and that the Dunbars had taken him. She had no money, no lawyer, and no support. When the courts ruled in favor of the Dunbars, she lost custody forever. She returned to Mississippi, heartbroken, labeled a liar and an unfit mother by the press. For decades, Bobby Dunbar lived his life, unaware of the truth. However, in the early 2000s, his grandson began researching the family's history. Sensing something was amiss, the family eventually consented to a DNA test, comparing Bobby's descendants with those of the original Dunbars. The results ultimately debunked a century-old belief. The boy who had grown up as Bobby Dunbar was not biologically related to the Dunbars. He was Bruce Anderson. Julia Anderson had been telling the truth all along, which means the real Bobby Dunbar was never found. To this day, no one knows what actually happened to him, whether he drowned, was abducted, or suffered some unknown fate. His case remains officially unresolved. Meanwhile, an innocent man was imprisoned, and another family raised a child who wasn't theirs, all because the truth was too painful, and the need for closure outweighed the facts. In 1928, 9-year-old Walter Collins disappeared from his home in Los Angeles. His mother, Christine Collins, had given him a few coins to go see a movie. While she was working, he never came home. Christine went to the police, who launched a search. His case quickly made headlines. This was during a time of rising fears about crime and child abductions, and public pressure on the LAPD was intense. For 5 months, Christine kept the search alive. She printed flyers, organized searches, gave interviews. Then in August, police in Illinois picked up a boy who claimed to be Walter. He was brought to Los Angeles to be reunited with Christine in front of reporters. But as the cameras flashed and police beamed with pride, thinking they had solved the case, when Christine saw the boy, she said, "That's not my son." The police told her she was wrong. They insisted he had changed from the trauma. They encouraged her to take him home on a trial basis. Christine reluctantly agreed, likely pressured by the public scene. But after just 3 weeks, she returned to the LAPD and again said, "This is not my son." This time the police had her committed to a psychiatric hospital, claiming she was hysterical and refusing to accept reality. Meanwhile, the boy admitted that he wasn't Walter. His real name was Arthur Hutchins, a runaway who had been pretending to be Walter Collins to get a free trip to California. He thought it might help him to meet his favorite actors. So that meant the police had publicly reunited a grieving mother with a random child, and then punished her when she didn't go along with the lie. That should have been the end of the story, but it gets darker around the same time. A Canadian man named Gordon Northcott was arrested for a string of murders on a chicken farm in Winesville, California. He had lured young boys to his property, imprisoned them, and eventually killed them. When authorities raided the farm, they found evidence linking Northcott to multiple victims. One of those victims they believed was Walter Collins. Christine pleaded for answers, but Northcott never gave a clear confession. Walter Collins's fate remained a mystery. Despite convictions for other murders, Christine dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, relentlessly searching in Los Angeles. The city never offered a formal apology for unjustly institutionalizing her when she refused to accept their fabricated story. The story later inspired the film Changeling with Angelina Jolie. But the real horror is how it actually happened. A grieving mother, gaslit by the system, a lost child exploited for headlines, and a police force more interested in good press than truth. In August of 2008, a 24-year-old Canadian woman named Kayla Reed vanished from a small town in British Columbia. She had recently moved back in with her parents after going through a rough breakup and was trying to start over. One evening she told her mother she was going to meet a friend at a coffee shop nearby. She left around 7:30 p.m. wearing a light hoodie and jeans, carrying her phone, but no purse. She never showed up for that meeting. Her phone went dark less than an hour later. What followed was an immediate and massive local search. Flyers went up, and volunteers swarmed the forested areas around town. Search dogs found nothing, and there was no sign of foul play, no dropped phone, no torn clothing, no surveillance footage. It seemed Kayla had completely vanished. As expected, her parents were devastated. Kayla was described as responsible and grounded, not the kind of person to run off without telling anyone. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Eventually the case went cold, but then a full year later, something happened. Kayla showed up in the early morning hours of July 5th, 2009. She walked into a hospital nearly 200 miles from where she disappeared. She was disoriented, dehydrated, and barefoot. She was also noticeably thinner, sunburned, and wearing clothes that didn't belong to her. She refused to speak to doctors. She simply wrote her name down on a piece of paper. The hospital staff called police, and after fingerprint confirmation, it was officially her. She had been missing for 11 months. Her parents, of course, rushed to see her, but even then, Kayla said almost nothing. She stared at them blankly, occasionally smiling, but she didn't hug them. When they asked where she had been, she said, "Only I was in the dark. I was safe, but it wasn't me." Authorities were baffled. She had no visible injuries or signs of abuse. Toxicology came back clean. She had no head trauma, no signs of having been drugged long-term, no tattoos or branding or anything that would suggest organized abduction. She spent a week in the hospital under psychiatric observation, and then she was quietly released to her family. No charges were filed, and no statements were ever made. Kayla never spoke publicly about where she had been. She deleted all her social media accounts and moved away within a year. Despite persistent efforts by reporters, her family declined all interviews, leading to the official closure of the case. She was a missing person who reappeared, yet the mystery surrounding her disappearance remained unsolved. The young woman who returned was undeniably altered, not physically harmed, but profoundly changed by her experience. One nurse from the hospital said that in her last shift, before Kayla was discharged, the girl looked her dead in the eyes and whispered, "Don't go into the woods alone. They find you there." No one knows what she meant, but no one who worked that case ever forgot it. In October 2017, in the city of Santa Rosa, California, a 15-year-old high school student named Connor Hastings disappeared while walking home from school. He took the same route every day, a suburban street surrounded by homes and parks. But one afternoon, he didn't show up. His mom called him, but there was no answer. When she checked with friends, no one had seen him since he left school. By 7:00 p.m. police were notified, and a search began immediately. His backpack was found a day later, dumped behind a dumpster, a few blocks from his usual route, but his phone was gone for weeks. The case dominated local headlines. Police dogs tracked a scent trail that ended suddenly at the edge of a wooded trail, where it seemed to just stop. It was strange because no tire tracks were left behind, and there were 0 witnesses. When detectives questioned classmates, rumors began spreading. Some kids claimed Connor had been acting paranoid in the days just before he went missing, like he was jumping at noises and asking people if they'd seen the man in the red jacket. One friend said, Connor had recently asked about how to tell if you're being watched. The trail went cold, but 5 minutes later, in March of 2018, Connor returned, or rather he was found. A 911 call came in from a payphone, one of the few still operating in the area, and the caller reported a teenage boy sitting on a bench, unresponsive outside a small town library, 60 miles away. When police found Connor, he was silent and staring ahead. His hair was much longer than when he'd last been seen, and his clothes were filthy. He had a spiral-bound notebook clutched in both hands, but it was completely blank. He wouldn't speak for over 24 hours. When his parents arrived, he hugged his mother tightly and then burst into tears. But even then, he said very little about where he had been. Over the next few days, he opened up only slightly. He claimed he had been taken by a group, but couldn't describe their faces. He said they kept him somewhere without clocks, somewhere cold. When police asked how he escaped, he said they just let me go. I think I passed their test. A month later, he gave one final statement before refusing to speak publicly again. He said there were others. I heard them. I wasn't the only one. But I might be the only one. They gave back the notebook he had been holding. The night he was found remained empty. No one could get him to write anything in it. But on the final page, in the bottom corner, written in shaky pen, were 4 words. I was not alone. Police never identified any such specs. The FBI reviewed the case, but released no findings. Connor eventually changed schools, and now lives under a different name to this day. His case is officially solved because he came back, but nobody really believes that. That's the end of the story. On the night of February 9th, 2004, a 21-year-old nursing student named Maura Murray vanished after a minor car crash on a remote stretch of Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. Nearly 2 decades later, no one knows where she went, what she was running from, or who might have been waiting for her earlier that day. Maura left her dorm at UMass Amherst after sending emails to her professors, telling them there had been a death in the family and she'd be gone for a few days, but no one in her family had died. In fact, no one in her life was planning to leave. She packed a bag, withdrew nearly all the money from her bank account, and bought a few items including alcohol from a nearby store. She then drove north into the White Mountains alone, without a clear destination. Around 7:27 p.m., a local woman reported a car accident to 911, stating a small black Saturn had crashed into a snowbank on a sharp turn outside her house. When police arrived 20 minutes later, they found the vehicle, but no sign of the driver. The car was locked, and the windshield was cracked. Both airbags had deployed. A box of wine was spilled across the interior. The only thing missing was Maura, a bus driver who lived nearby, had seen her just minutes before police. He stopped and spoke to her through the window. She looked cold and shaken, but declined help. He drove off and called in the accident. But by the time the officers reached the scene, Maura had vanished. Not just walked away, vanished. Police dogs tracked her scent for about 100 yards up the road. Then it stopped abruptly. No footprints in the woods or any belongings left behind. It was like someone picked her up in a car, just out of view. Her phone and credit cards were never used again. The bottles of alcohol she had bought, some were gone, and some remained in the car. There were no obvious signs of foul play, but nothing added up. She had no history of mental illness. Friends and family said she wasn't suicidal. She was planning for the future, and yet she was gone in the years that followed. Her case became one of the most obsessively followed mysteries on the internet. Armchair detectives, forums, and podcasters picked apart every detail. Some believed she staged her disappearance to start a new life. Others believed she was abducted by a stranger or someone she arranged to meet. Then there are darker theories: a serial predator operating the mountains, or a cover-up, but nothing concrete ever came, and her body was never found. Something obviously happened to Mara Murray that night, something that was likely deliberate, and to this day, the forest around Route 112 still holds its secrets. And the most chilling part is, if she was taken, whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing and never made a single mistake. In the remote town of Nome, Alaska, a place isolated by hundreds of miles of tundra, accessible mostly by air, people are used to strange things happening. The winters are long and brutal, and the nights seem endless. But even there, among the quiet, snow-covered streets and howling wind, the disappearance of Rick Hills in 2004 is something people still whisper about, not because it was the only one, but because of how it happened and what was left behind. Rick Hills was a 37-year-old electrician, hard-working, quiet, not particularly social, but he was well liked by the people who knew him. He lived alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of town near the edge of the wilderness. It was not unusual and known to be that isolated. Many people preferred it. But Rick's case became more disturbing when it was discovered. He wasn't the first one to go missing from that area. In fact, in the 10 years before he vanished, over 20 people had disappeared from no one under similarly strange circumstances. The FBI would eventually investigate it as a pattern, but Rick's story was different, more personal and terrifying. On November 13th, 2004, Rick failed to show up for work. His boss called him repeatedly to no avail. That evening, a co-worker drove to Rick's cabin. His truck was there, and the lights were off. It had snowed lightly that afternoon, but when they got closer, they noticed something strange. No footprints in or out of the cabin. It was like Rick had never left or returned. The co-worker knocked, but there was no response. So he walked around the property and saw that the back door was open. He called out and stepped inside. The place was undisturbed. The coffee pot was full, and his cell phone was on the table, but there was no sign of Rick himself. The weirdest part was the bed was made, not like someone had just gotten out of it. The weird part was that the bed was made so neatly, it looked as though no one had ever been in it. The co-worker called the police, and they searched the home. Then they searched the surrounding area, and then the woods. They brought dogs, drones, helicopters, and still found nothing, even with the light snowfall. There should have been some sign of direction, like a trail or blood or something, but there was no trace. The man walked out of his cabin with no coat, no boots, no keys, and simply just disappeared. The investigation didn't find foul play. He reportedly had no enemies or debts. Even his bank account was untouched, and his phone had not pinged a tower since the day before. But then 2 days later, something happened that the public wasn't told about until years later. A hiker about 30 miles north of Nome found something bizarre: a man's sock frozen into the mud of a game trail. Nearby, hidden under a thin layer of snow, was an old Polaroid photograph. It was dirty and crumpled, and its image nearly destroyed by the cold, but the outline was clear. It was Rick's cabin, shot from the woods. The angle showed the living room window, and in the reflection was a face, but it wasn't Rick's. The photo was turned over to the police, but they never released it to the public. Years later, An officer who worked the case anonymously told the local journalist that it was the most disturbing thing he'd ever seen in his career, that the face and the reflection didn't look entirely human. He described it as off, like distorted, pale, the eyes too wide, and the mouth slightly open, as if it had been caught mid-whispers, like someone caught staring, who didn't expect to be seen, as he described it. The area was searched again, but nothing was found, and no further signs of Rick. Locals started calling it the Watcher, saying something in the woods had been taking people. To local legend spoke of a dark man, a creature of the trees, emerging at night, connected to disappearances spanning decades, while the FBI attributed these incidents to weather, accidents, and alcohol. Those familiar with the cases held a different belief. Despite the official stance, they knew it wasn't weather, and it wasn't a misadventure. Rick was used to those woods. He wouldn't have wandered out barefoot without a jacket in sub-zero temperatures. He would not have left his door open, and he wouldn't have vanished without a single track in the snow. To this day, Rick Hills has never been found. Some say it was just a tragic accident. Others say Rick saw something he shouldn't have, something that was watching